All right, welcome back, Social 30. We're going to take another look at the textbook. This time we're into related issue 4, which looks at ideology and the citizen. And we're looking at chapter 13, reflecting on worldview, ideology, and citizenship. Chapters 13 and 14 are definitely secondary chapters in terms of how much attention we provide for them, but there's still some gems that we need to look at. So one of the gems that I would say look for in chapter 13 would be the different definitions of citizenship. What is citizenship is a complex question. It can be shaped by many things. It can be shaped by worldview and by ideology, and in different situations, different times, different places, the term citizenship can mean different things. For example, national definition of Métis. Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, is distinct from other Aboriginal or First Nations people here in Canada. So the idea that in Canada we have, within our First Nations, we have different citizenships. We have different not classifications, but different groupings, different collective identities, right? Different collective identities. That would be a way to say it. The Canadian citizenship. Within our citizenship ceremony, we swear an oath of citizenship that you will be faithful and have true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada. It also talks about Israeli citizenship, and I find that one interesting because in Israel, because of their unique geopolitical circumstances, Israeli citizenship does come with a heightened responsibility to protect the collective from the aggression of their neighbors. The textbook also talks about some legal perspectives. Citizenship can be based upon jus soli, the right to the soil, or jus sanguinii, the right of blood. And please be kind with my pronunciation. I do struggle. I definitely struggle with that. So the textbook talks about how there are many Canadians that may have, as we would have talked about in Social 20, may have contending, divided loyalties, or they're hybrid. They might be Israeli Canadians, and because of their unique idea of which nation they belong to, they may have citizenship obligations, responsibilities to more than one nation, and historically there have been times where this can mean a change in relationship with the Canadian government. So the Canadian government at times has needed to spend billions of dollars to rescue Canadian citizens who may be experiencing turmoil in their birth country. So they may have been born in, say, Lebanon, moved to Canada, or born in Syria, moved to Canada, but they're living back in Syria, and now the political environment in Syria is disintegrating, and the Canadian government will try to help those citizens to come back to Canada. As we know from Social 10, there's a broader understanding of what it means to be a citizen. There's global citizenship. And in a ever increasingly inter or hyper-connected global village are ideas of national citizenships, the idea that my obligations to others stops at my borders might be quite infantile because of the waves of change that know no borders, that if we see ourselves somehow disconnected with others, then we will be more than shocked when those ramifications come fluttering our way. So we do have people that have multiple citizenship, as I was mentioning. In 2006, the Canadian government sent ships to remove people from the war zone in Lebanon. 15,000 Lebanese citizens were hurried aboard Canadian ships and taken to safety. Of the 15,000 Lebanese citizens evacuated from Beirut by Canadian forces, some 7,000 went back and and went home to live in Lebanon again shortly thereafter. So the question could be asked, what responsibility do we have for dual citizens? We have some unique ideas. There was a former hockey player called Gino Ojek that was Algonquin, and often when he'd travel from Canada to the U.S., and they asked him for his papers at the border, he would show some papers that identified him as a member of the Algonquin Nation. And there's a unique story from Thomas King's Borders that talks about a similar situation with an individual crossing a border, and when they asked her citizenship, she would say Blackfoot, and then the individual at the border would say Canadian, and the woman would say Blackfoot, and this went on and on until eventually the guard recognized that she wasn't going to identify as Canadian, and he let her through. So it is interesting to see in an ever-changing but yet more connected world, how we identify as different collectives may create some confusion and uncertainty, right? The rights, roles, and responsibilities of citizens are outlined in the textbook, and there's some great historical background on liberty. So we watched an 8-minute video in lesson 18 about the evolution of human rights, and here it talks about how we can trace our human rights back to Cyrus in his cylinder in the 6th century BCE in Persia, which outlined rights such as religious freedom, very very unique that an individual at this time would allow for religious freedom. Also, his abolition of slavery. We also could go back even further to the Code of Hammurabi from 1780 BCE. So these are key moments in the evolution of human rights. Hammurabi's code, Cyrus's cylinder, that began to outline, what are our rights, and are they natural, are they native to all? And then we have other key moments like the Magna Carta of 1215, that talks about how the power of the king is not absolute, and that it is subject to a constitution, an agreement with the people. Then we have other key documents like the American Declaration of Human Rights, and ultimately the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. So it is maybe not a recall exam headed your way where there's a test where you have to know 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, or 1789 the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. But what we want you to understand is the significance of rights, and in order to understand the significance, it's key to understand the story, the struggles that our ancestors faced in order to achieve the human rights that we have today. But the idea that this chapter also leaves us with is the idea that rights come with responsibilities. So we have legal rights, but that means we have a responsibility to obey Canadian laws. We have equality rights, but that means we have a responsibility to express opinions freely while respecting the rights and freedoms of others. We have the freedom of thought, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, but we do have the responsibility to eliminate discrimination based upon these things. So with rights comes responsibilities and duties. The heart of Aboriginal or First Nations self-government is the idea of citizenship. Citizenship, the collective identity that we feel. And again, citizenship is an evolving idea, isn't it? If there is a tsunami in Sri Lanka, what is our responsibility to those suffering? What is our call to global citizenship? And how do we serve the collective? Does service to the collective involve military service? And do we only serve the collective, therefore, if we volunteer, or is a draft, therefore, a reasonable thing because ultimately we must defend the body politique, we must defend the nation from all enemies, both domestic and foreign? Then we jump into chapter 14. So I'm not going to do two separate chapter reviews here. I'm going to do just one because I really do truly see related issue 4 as one topic, and combined with chapter 13 and 14 together might have a little bit more rigor. So what chapter 14 does is it gives us more case studies to look at in terms of understanding the role of citizens with regards to their governments. So by the end of the chapter, you'll know more about anti-war movements and pro-democracy movements, and it begins with the Orange Crush Revolution in Ukraine, where you had Viktor Yushchenko, which became quite ill when he was poisoned as an attempt to control the election. His opponents had him poisoned, hoping that he would die. But if he survives, the once handsome politician would lose the attractiveness, the physical attractiveness, and hopefully it would discredit him. It didn't. It rallied the people behind him, and then when he lost the election, there was this great massive pro-democracy movement where hundreds of thousands occupied the public squares in Kiev demanding a recount of the election, and ultimately they did achieve that recount in December of 2004, and he became the leader of Ukraine. We also have other examples in here. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa with the work of the African National Congress and individuals like Nelson Mandela attempting to use the law and civil disobedience to protect his fellow black Africans. The ANC eventually resorted to acts of violence in retaliation for similar acts by the South African government. So a question that you should ask as you read through this chapter is, under what circumstances is violent protest justified? We also see some other protests in history beyond the scope of just looking at changing South Africa, but we have similar issues in America. The war in Vietnam, the idea of protesting your country's foreign policy. The anti-war movement began slowly in the 50s and early 60s, but by the end of the 1960s became so great that it shaped an election and changed American foreign policy. It began to have Americans question not only if a war is just, but had them question their own identity as a country among countries. What roles was America allowed to have internationally? The textbook then obviously goes into something more contemporary, which would be Canada in Afghanistan, and to what extent should Canadians support Canadian military being used in peacemaking beyond peacekeeping missions? Under what circumstances is a war today just, when Canada at the time the textbook was created was at war in Afghanistan? As it looks at protests and boycotts, definitely the textbook could be updated because we've had a decade and a half of protests and boycotts since, but it introduces the concept of protests and boycotts, and that's how the textbook really ends, is this idea of if the year was about one thing, it's about the relationship between citizens and government, and then when we as citizens feel our government is misleading us, then I really want you to begin to create an inventory of these are times when people were compelled to protest. This is the toxin within the relationship. This was the protest, and this is the outcome, the change it achieved. So, for example, in the streets of America today, we have Black Lives Matter protest. So the problem they see within society would be inequality, a systemic inequality. We hear a lot of terms like social justice and white privilege, and the idea of the critical race theory. All of this is an umbrella around a problem that some see within society, and they see a way of influencing the change is through protest. Here in Canada, we are not immune to problems within our society, flaws within citizen-to-citizen interaction, but also government-to-citizen. And historically, one of the flaws that really has been resonating is the relationship between Canada's government, our federal government, and our First Nations. And therefore, the legacies of residential schools have been something that is very contentious. And therefore, in order to achieve true truth and reconciliation, the idea is, how can we bring about that change, that change that we're looking for in Canada? How can we create a better Canada, a more inclusive Canada, and at the same time address, past injustices? So that's how the textbook ends. The textbook ends with this idea that now that we've talked about ideologies, now how do we put them in practice with our relationships with each other and our government? And hopefully it ends with some questions that should intrigue some thought.